because you're jumping back into the gap. Outlet to coach, it's either sideline, 2 on the side, 3 on the side. That's off the second cut. Leads the country in offensive rebounding.
Hey coach, welcome to the Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Oliver, the founder, CEO, and creative mind behind BasketballImmersion.com. This is the podcast where you will hear real basketball coaching conversations. Whether you are a new or experienced coach at any level of basketball, these coaching conversations will give you practical ideas to stimulate your coaching and make what you do even better. Without any more delay, let's share the game. Excited today to have Luke Yaklich. Luke is the current assistant coach at the University of Michigan, but most famous this year because of the Final Four run, but has had tremendous success through all of his career in coaching, and there's a lot of various places that he's been. And Luke, long overdue to have you on the podcast today. We don't talk enough defense, probably. We tend to have an offense a little bit because coaches really like to talk offense. But today we get to talk to one of the top basketball minds about defense, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for the introduction. There's a lot of words there that I'm not sure that are fitting, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk defense, talk coaching, and to finally kind of connect here, Chris. We've been kind of, I think, about 4 emails in trying to make this work, but we had a busy summer and then we went to Spain and it was just kind of timing of it all didn't work, but I am really super excited about this conversation.
Well, perseverance on both of our parts to get it done. And I know coaches will be grateful to hear this. And Coach, I mean, we don't talk much about backgrounds here. We like to get into the technical, tactical.
No doubt.
Yep. But for you, a little bit of a different story in terms of your progression, because a longtime high school coach and then into university and coaching at the college level. So can you talk a little bit about that transition? And did you find it was that big a transition from an X's and O's standpoint? We can talk about a lot of X's and O's standpoint. We can talk about recruiting and all that, but let's stay away from that.
Yeah.
From just your X's point. Was it a big difference, or were you finding you were doing a lot of the same things at the high school level?
You know what? There were so many different things, Chris, that I left Joliet High School in Illinois after 15 years of being a head coach in the state of Illinois. It's one of those things you get outside your comfort zone, and it was a job that I loved teaching and coaching at Joliet. It was like I had finally had the dream situation of what I wanted to do. I was mentoring young teachers. Then I got to teach 2 U.S. history classes, and the principal there allowed me to design our own curriculum with English and history. So it was like, and then there was the head basketball coach, and I just loved everything about it. And so I originally turned the job down, Chris. And then my wife was talking to Coach Muller, kind of texting, because Dan and I had been close, and she kind of just said, Dan, hey, tap the brakes. I dove right in. So I think the key difference was obviously recruiting has its own thing, but then the time that you get with the players, it was great because I was really worried about how do you develop a relationship with the college guys, because I was really close with the high school kids that I coached. But then you're around the college guys a lot. The hotel room, it's a plane, it's a meeting room, it's on the practice floor, it's in the film room. Like there's a great bond that you're able to really have a positive impact on young people in the profession at the college level. And it really goes to whatever you make it. So I think one of the key things that I've kind of has guided my teaching and coaching philosophy, Chris, is simply try to be the coach and the teacher that you would want your son or daughter to have. And that was my philosophy each and every day, kind of walked into the building, is that you got to be that person. And then from an X's and O's standpoint on the floor, it was for each and every day, kind of walked into the building, is that you got to be that person. And then from an X's and O's standpoint on the floor, it was, you have to teach it very efficiently. You've got your 2-hour block or whatever on the floor, and, you don't have kind of 4 days, like in a high school level, Monday through Thursday to get for a Friday night game. So it's kind of, you got a game Wednesday, you got a game Saturday, so you got to be really efficient. That's something I learned from Coach Muller, and then obviously continued with Coach Beeline, is just your efficiency of your time and your planning of everything that you do and how it connects from A to B to whatever letter you end with that game to get ready and prepared is really, really important. And you have to make sure that, I think Doc Rivers said at a clinic I was at probably about 10 years ago, it's It's fresh minds and fresh legs. And so there's just always this balance about at the college level, but we got to have them ready to play. What do they need most in the given time that we have?
Well, and I've heard you speak about that before in a few interviews, just about maximizing essentially time on task and efficiencies and whatnot within practice. And I got to think that's a big mindset at both places you've been as well. And it's not that you have time to waste in high school. It's actually your practices are longer. If you don't maximize them, then that's when you get into obviously tired legs and tired minds. So I assume that's a little bit of what that process is.
Yeah, for sure, Chris. That's exactly it. It's just about the efficiency of planning each and every day. And we would meet on practice at both Illinois State and here at Michigan. And Coach B, once we go through each and every practice every day to make sure that everybody knows exactly what we need to have taught in the time period that needs to be accomplished, and then try to have as many things going on and accomplished at one time without losing the teaching component of it. So that's where the best head coaches, for two really good head coaches that have taught me a ton. But the main thing is just about is making that, whatever it is, if it's an hour and 45 or 2:15 that you have on the floor or somewhere in between, that each and every minute of that is planned accordingly towards the end goal. And I think one of the teaching strategies I used to use as a high school teacher, when you plan out the year, just planning out a daily lesson, is you kind of begin with the end in mind. Like, what do we want them to learn and where do we want them to get to? And I think you backward plan with that in mind, and you end up being very efficient at the end of the day.
Well, coming into such a unique situation, obviously with a future Hall of Fame coach and Coach Beeline, and clearly having a little bit of an established mentality or philosophy defensively, how much flexibility was there within that environment to be able to add and change? And even something as simple as terminology, your terminology may have been different than Coach Beeline's. Was that a shared process to be able to come to, a like-minded terminology or like-minded philosophy in terms of the things that you wanted to do?
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it, Chris. I think, when I first walked in, you have your culture set, and it's clear that we had culture was set, and coach knew exactly what he wanted, but we really talk about the growth mindset, and we kind of live it each and every day. And he was the type of person that wanted to keep learning, and that's the approach each and every day. And so when we kind of had to marry the two things together, and okay, what's this ball screen defense for you? And I didn't want to have to implement any type of language that I used and have the staff plus 15 players have to learn a new thing just because I came on staff. So I really, it was literally the first email I think that I sent to our video coordinator was, give me all the terms defensively, and can we sit down and talk about what they mean? So I really studied those for, that first week that I got on the job, just so that when we went out to the floor, I was able to use their terminology, and I think it eased the transition. And then Coach B and I would talk about different ways and what we thought were good for that particular group last year. And then there may be some concepts or some teaching points that I'd used as a high school coach or learned from Coach Muller or just learned from a clinic that kind of seemed to fit. And we talk about those, and we kind of just kept chiseling away, Chris, until we got to the point where it's like, okay, this is our terminology. And by the time November got around, we were continuing to evolve as a defensive unit, but we had that defensive terminology set. And I think that's such a key part of any defensive system, Chris. Like, I think the whole teaching of communication and talk on defense is one of the things in coaching I think we let slide. And we just say, well, kids don't like to talk. It's hard to teach that. It's really hard to teach it, but there are ways to do it. And it's just like anything, I think you get what you put up with. And whatever you emphasize, the guys are going to respond to. And the team we had at Illinois State the last 2 years were unbelievable talkers because coach demanded it. And we just continued to emphasize it. And we did so here. And I think you can cultivate that type of culture and your defensive system. But you can only do that. And I say all that, Chris, because you have to know, your kids have to know what they're supposed to say. And a lot of times that's not always discussed. So one thing I would suggest to a lot of coaches, Chris, is just take all your defensive terminology and just put it on one piece of paper. And like we bring guys in and just say, here's a highlighter, highlight the terms that you guys know, like absolutely 100%. You can go down on the court and it could explain it to a sixth grader. And we kind of go from there and just kind of chip away until everybody knows exactly the terminology to say in the moment.
Well, and I was going to ask you, because that's something like we all say we ask for communication, but asking for it is different than teaching it. And is obviously, what are you doing to teach it? And what specific practical, actionable things are you doing? And I'm so glad you touched on that, because just something as simple as your players, making sure your players actually know your terminology, because we assume it and then we get frustrated when they don't say it, but they don't say it because they don't understand it. Sometimes just as much as they don't know that it's valuable. Well, we all emphasize it to a certain extent, but what are some other things that you do within practice to make it accountable, or how you emphasize it? What are some specific actionable things there for coaches?
Yeah, I think one thing, Chris, we're experimenting this year's in just like one-on-one, 1-on-0, 2-on-2 gap defense. You think about like what it takes to get out of a drill. Terms, be in certain positions on the floor, whatever your terminology is, give a number to that. So if you're doing 2-on-2 on the side, or you're talking post defense, you got to say, we've got to hear you 10 times, 10 terms. It's not going to be 10 different terms, obviously. We need to hear you talk 10 times when you're supposed to say it and exactly the way you're supposed to say it loud. And then you're out of the drill. I think when you have that accountability piece, that talking is that important, I think that transfers over. And then a second thing is there are some natural communicators on your team. And I think a key part is to empower and reward those players for being great communicators. And I think that like last year, it started with Xavier Simpson. He just had this, he wanted to talk, and he was good and competitive and comfortable hearing his voice out there. And I think then that kind of just, it went on from one person to the other. And then Mo, he gravitated toward that, and Charles Matthews. And then, so it happened each year at Illinois State. It was Paris Lee and Tony Wills and Deontay Hawkins. And like, you just keep building that communication, embracing that and empowering that. And then eventually the guys are going to get it, like in a game or a practice, that they're going to sit back, or the light bulb's going to go on in their mind and say, wow, the communication actually, it helps.
Coach, first of all, like that 10-time thing is tremendous. And I think coaches got to find a way to use something like that, because that's specifically what I'm saying is like, what's an actual actionable item? And that's great. But the other thing you said, which goes beyond just rewarding the player who speaks a lot. Like, because that's what we say. We reward the player who speaks a lot. But sometimes we ignore the player that speaks a lot because they already speak. And it's just as important to make sure that we continue to acknowledge you need to that reward as well.
Yeah, it is. And I think, having players, I think defensively, like I would tell our guys, last year when we were going through things, I said, as we game plan towards whatever opponent X, you need to question me. Like, just why? Let's get the why down. And then I think once the players understand the why of everything, and that's something that I think Coach B is really, really good at, is explaining the why of everything, that there's a purpose to it. And here's what we're thinking as a coaching staff. But I think in building a defensive culture, take your guys and say, okay, you challenge in a good way. Practice, they say, Coach, you think we should do this on the side ball screener? Do you think that's the best way we should defend that? We did it against Maryland, but should we do it against Michigan State? And there were always those conversations being had last year in particular, just about game plan. It was a team thing, that how we evolved in terms of like this communication was like a two-way street. And so it's like you have your communication that you have outwardly with your team and what you want them to say. But then there's also like a communication piece where they understand the why. I just feel, Chris, like they understand that they're willing to talk more outwardly about it because they're more confident in what they do. And then you just keep promoting things of great defense. Like we just have a stat, I just have a communication piece where they understand the why. I just feel, Chris, like they understand that they're willing to talk more outwardly about it because they're more confident in what they do. And then you just keep promoting things of great defense. Like we just have a stat where the managers, Chris, will watch and listen at practice, and I will do the same thing. We tally up with our managers just great communication possessions, and we show those sometimes more than once a week, but usually once a week. We'll go through those numbers and just say, hey, this person had 20 great communication possessions, and we just promote it.
Well, and sometimes it's that simple, but as you know, most coaches don't have access to those tools. So that's why I have something as simple as actual, as you said, but even the phrase communication possessions, like just, again, making an edit of that, whether it be from a game or otherwise, I mean, just a tremendous thing. I mean, that's great and very actionable now.
And you just shut the other part of communication on defense is coaches have to shut up during practice. There's got to be possessions where you just say it's going to be silent. That was a hard thing for me. I want to be involved, my voice, but there are times I just have to, I cross my arms, and that's kind of my stance of I've got to shut up here and just observe what's going on. And you take those possessions in your practice and turn up the volume in the film room, and who do you hear? Like, it's just a simple way of like looking, okay, I heard Mo calling out the ball screen early, and I heard Charles calling where he was supposed to be on help side defense. And I think those type of things, you just promote them in their own little unique ways. And I think if you view communication as a 1% thing, I'm a big 1% guy, like 1% better every single day. In 100 days, you're a brand new player. And that's the way I think you have to. And that's the way I think you have to look at it with defense. It's not going to be something that's going to like, oh my gosh, we got it figured out. I think I felt that way probably in the middle of late January last year. Like, okay, these guys totally understand the value of defense. And when you get to the point where if you're not talking, the other guys are holding them accountable to your silence, that's when you got them. And I think, one last kind of phrase that I would use in coaches is the weakest link type thing. And Coach Muller would always talk about don't be that guy. And our guys knew what that meant. But I kind of used this last year. You can only be as good as your most silent defender. Right. And if you kind of look at that way, it's like you sell your team on something like that. Just don't be that guy that's the guy not talking.
Oh, that's great. That's a great quote. And I mean, so many things there that you said, clearly you empower your players in the process. You empower them in their execution of what you're trying to get them to do. So that's great that you allow for that. And I believe that applies at all levels. I mean, that's just not a college level. That's a high school level. I mean, it's at all levels that you can empower your players to be involved. And again, you don't have to do what they say, but you give them a voice. And ultimately, you come to a shared agreement about what's the best action, and then we're empowered to do it. So that's tremendous.
Yeah. Yep.
Coach, I know we could spend this whole podcast on communication. And again, I mean, so much of defense people say effort, but communication is such a huge part of defense. And we're going to talk a little bit about building a defensive culture. So do you want to talk in general terms a little bit about that, about building a defensive culture and some of the strategies that coaches can apply?
Yeah, I think a key piece that often gets kind of overlooked from the defensive side of it when you talk about culture is like be our team on offense. And who's going to come off a ball screen, who can shoot a runaway three, where a certain guy can score in the post, and guys that are what pass they can throw off a ball screen, etc. So I think that in order to build a culture, Chris, I think it's important to flip it around and really study your team defensively the same way you would study your team on offense. So like a couple things would be like, who's the guy that, we can switch screens with? Who can slide his feet laterally? Who can guard in space well? Who's good at what area can he defend the post from? And I'm just throwing some random questions out here, but really study your team. And on top of that, your team has to understand, I think, to be good defensively, Chris, that your team knows who's going to shoot. Team knows who's going to shoot an open three and who's not going to. I think they pretty much know that. Who's going to bring the ball up the floor? Who's going to come off the ball screen? Like, your team would be able to tell you that. So to flip it around, if you ask your team who would have trouble guarding 3 dribbles against another player, I'm guessing from open gym and whatever work you're doing in the fall, that most of your players are going to be able to answer that question.
Well, it's an interesting question from the perspective too, that like then your teammates will know, and we talk about it in terms like this, but that your players would have to know who they have to cheat towards to provide extra help and who they can cheat towards their defender because they shouldn't have to provide extra help. Is that the mentality of what we're trying to get to, that our players truly understand individual defensive piece? Yeah.
Yeah, you get to that point, Chris, and it's like, what is the
defensive piece? Yeah.
Yeah, you get to that point, Chris, and it's like, what is the goal of defense? The goal of defense, whatever your goal is, like I'd have like, what is your possession goal? Put it in one sentence for your players. Like everybody could say, like, we're going to keep it out of here. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're going to do that. Okay. At the end of it all, like when you chisel everything away and you get it down to its most basic form, what are you playing for? And I think when you then take that sentence, whatever that is, as a staff, then you follow it up and say, okay, well, how does, player 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 fit into that role in order to get us to that goal? And it's got to be a thing where what our main thing is, then let's make sure that we can support everybody else with their strengths and their weaknesses. So if you to have a weakness on defense, just as long as you understand it and then your team understands it. And I think that's where the thoughtful study of who you are as a defensive unit comes into play. And I think that's something I learned as a high school coach, is that you have your base offense, but you know that you have players that they have a little bit more freedom within that offense because of their skill level. And I think it's the same thing on defense at times, is that you have your base, but then you also have these interchangeable parts that all have different strengths and weaknesses, and getting the players to understand that, kind of getting over the ego, like, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to stick this guy at 21 feet. Like, not everybody could do that. It's the hardest thing to do in basketball, is to guard the ball, especially with the rules and everything. So you got to have support. And the only way you can really develop that culture is to understand what the strengths and weaknesses are as a unit, make sure they understand them. And then you can kind of build from there.
Well, it's tremendous. And I know a lot of coaches talk about offensive matchups and that you have a matchup on offense. And we talk about it equally on defense, about you have a positive defensive matchup or you have a negative defensive matchup. And what are your teammates doing in those situations? So this is awesome. Yep. It's wonderful stuff to think about.
Yeah.
The depth that you can go to.
Yeah, you just got to get over, like some kids, you got to get over the ego that I need more help, or it's kind of like you KYP, your personnel, but it's also just KU, know you. So you have to know the guy you're guarding, and you also have to know who you are as a defender. And then when your teammates know that, then you kind of have a culture. And that could be zone or man, Chris, whatever it is. You have to be able to play well in both. And I think the best way to do that is to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses. And that comes back to you kind of taking time as a coach.
Side defenses. Do you find that players are a little more lax covering the ball because they know they can rely on their help? And if so, or if you do find that sometimes within players, what are some things that we can do to get them back focused on covering the ball? Because ultimately, like, a defense is stronger if individually we can cover without help. So what are some things that we can do to focus on that?
I think at the root of that is you get what you emphasize in that area. So I think some of it is just, your defensive philosophy. We're going to give support here and we're going to push them here. And then that kind of lends itself to just being sometimes lax on the ball. But I think a lot of coaches that I talk to in this just, you can't work on one-on-one, footwork enough. And that's sometimes, we work a lot on it on offense again, and flip it over again, and flip it over. How do you teach your defensive footwork? And are you taking time to do that, each and every day? As maybe it's a warm up, maybe it's right before you get into your key defensive segment, breakdowns of practice, but spending a lot of time in different situations, guarding the ball and how you want to guard the ball. Your players understanding where the help is at and what their responsibility is on the ball, I think, is a key piece in alleviating some of the mistakes that happen and just the pressure, so to speak, of guarding the ball. Like, tell that guy on the ball, if it's on the wing or the baseline, where are you okay taking this ball? Where's that help at? And I think those things are very key in your teaching. But at the same time, Chris, it's one-on-one basketball. Being able to guard the ball and guard a ball screen, I think, are key things that the footwork to that I key in your teaching. But at the same time, Chris, it's one-on-one basketball. Being able to guard the ball and guard a ball screen, I think, are key things that the footwork to that, I think that's where the players have to know the why. Why are you saying this? Because this is the plan behind us. This is how it's all going to fit together like a big puzzle piece. But the one-on-one time with the ball and understanding, and this goes back to, again, the individual strengths and weaknesses, Chris, of like, where can I put my feet and hand and how close can I be to this guy? And then the next rep, it may be totally different because you're guarding somebody else. And you have to be smart enough in the moment to be able to do that, recognize it, and then continue to work on however you teach your footwork on the ball. It needs to be done for 4 to 5 minutes, I think, every practice, especially when you prior to, your first game. And then it can, I think, be scaled back a little bit to an individualized when you see it in games of helping them. And then at the same time, then you take it and say, okay, Johnny's getting beat off the dribble a lot. We need to give him help support. Johnny, you're going to work on your footwork, but you're going to be back a little bit. You're going to use your length to contest a shot, but we just can't have you getting beat off the dribble so much. So I think there's a happy medium in all of that stuff. But if you're not working on that, I think 4 minutes a day, and that's all it takes.
And in those 4 to 5 minutes a day, Coach, are those more drills? Are they more live one-on-one situations? Or are they more small-sided game situations? Like, what happens in those 4 to 5 minutes in terms of getting players to individually cover the ball better?
Yeah, I think it could be different emphasis, Chris, each day. So one day it might be, we're just going to work on, methodical slides, staying in our stance, and we're just going to get a lot of reps of doing the movement of we're going to stay, what we're going to do with our hands, what we're going to do with our feet. And it's just kind of like the muscle memory phase, like, okay, we're going to follow through. This is how we follow through. This is how we move our feet on defense. And then another day, it may be just that we're going live from the wing. We're going to go live from the slot. We're going to go live from the top. You get 1, 2 dribbles. It's going to be off a live closeout. It's going to be off a long closeout. We're closing out to a guy that can shoot and dribble. So I think all of those things can be changed each and every day. And then you kind of you hit upon, make sure you kind of, mentally keeping track of what you're working on. And then the next day it could be 2-on-2 and then 3-on-3. But then I think every 4th day, you got to keep coming back to your base slide drills, staying in the stance, and how are you defending on the ball? And then it just keeps building again, that 1% rule. They will improve if we work on it. Now, if you emphasize 20 things, you emphasize nothing. So, I think you got to really emphasize and decide the 3 or 4 things that you want to focus on, and then you live with that. But you get really, really strong at those 3 to 4 things. And then if you have to tweak along the way about how you do a closeout or how you move your feet based upon an opponent, you've got that done, but you have a foundation of how it's going to be done. And you practice that in various competitive 1-on-1 dummy, 1-on-0, just sliding your feet to certain spots, and then 2-on-2, 3-on-3, and then ultimately into your shell drill and then your 5-on-5 stuff.
I appreciate you sharing some of this stuff openly, because there's a lot of practical ideas in everything that you're saying, and that's wonderful. And is there some other things in terms of building a defensive culture that you wanted to share?
I would just say, for I think any type of whatever you emphasize, I think coaches that if you're not statting it, it really doesn't matter to you. Well, the best rebounding team and box out team, that is great. I mean, that is okay. But if you're not statting how many times you're hitting, and then you could say it to a player and say, well, you didn't box out well, but what does that mean? Well, here it is. You only hit your guy 5 out of 10 times, and then you got 3 offensive rebounds. Like, if you can give that data towards whatever you want to emphasize as a defensive coach, I think that's the key piece of the whole thing. And that goes back to like the 20 things. If you say 20 things, and that's where I kind of learned it as a high school coach, and the defensive emphasis that I had is I started out with like 12 things, like, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that, we're not going to do that. And I went down like 1 through 12. And then it was like halfway through the season, it's just like, what is, like, it's just not all fitting together here because you can't keep track of everything. And ultimately, sometimes this stuff doesn't matter.
Yeah, no.
Find out what you want to size. And in defense, there are 20 things you can emphasize, but what's good for your group? Pick the 3 or 4 things. And again, if you're not statting it, I don't think that it matters to you, and it won't matter to your players. That's a key piece, is part of the whole defensive culture puzzle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I got to think one of the things that's got to be one of those important things in a defense nowadays is 3-point defense. And just understanding better, or for example, our team last year did a lot of individual defensive situations covering a live dribbler who shoots the ball from 3. And I got to think, like 10 years ago, I never would have even thought to do that drill. And, we play against 2 or 3 players usually within a week or within a 2-week period that can shoot the 3 off the dribble really well. So, For example, there's a change. Is that something that's changed in defense? And if so, what are some that's changed in defense? And if so, what are some of the things that we can do as coaches to better defend the 3-point line? On the ball and off the ball, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's such a key piece of your defensive philosophy of what you're going to give up. And, like everybody at the NBA level, and it's trickled down to the college level, is, no corner threes. So like for most teams that we play against, they're just simply not helping off of that coverage or that offensive setup. So I think a lot of it, Chris, is just really understanding with, scouting reports and with synergy and the amount of information that you have on a given team, beyond just the stats of is the ball going in or not, which is ultimately the most important thing, is why is it not going in? What type of shots is your opponent taking individually? And I think knowing that, in general, the whole concept is not a lot of people doing the ultimate kind of what the game plan is all about from the defensive side of the ball. So I think the lack of help responsibilities guarding shooters, that's what ultimately has changed. And then to piggyback on that, Chris, it's made the on-ball defense even more important, because if you're guarding at the most elite level, the Golden State Warriors, you're not helping on a dribble drive very much. So I think those are the 2 things that have kind of gone hand in hand with that, is it's put a premium on, everybody talks about a lot, kind of going off on a little, divergent a little bit here, but everybody talks about positionless basketball, and it's kind of the sexy word on offense. Like, I'm a positionless player. But on the other side of the ball, how valuable is a positionless defender? I think that's another, yeah, and it's another part of your defensive culture, that defense. Like, I'm a positionless player. But on the other side of the ball, how valuable is a positionless defender? I think that's another, and it's another part of your defensive culture that is easy to see. And I think every player that watches any type of basketball at any level understands that if you can guard stretch 4s now, if you can guard 4 positions, that's pretty incredible. And those guys are becoming more valuable on the other side. Responsibilities are becoming more valuable on the other side of the ball as well. So I think that's something you can emphasize in your culture as well. But, getting back to the 3 thing, I think the main thing is people are not given help, Chris. Yeah. That help responsibility is negated when you're guarding a kid that can make threes. And then again, on the flip side, it puts a premium on guarding the ball because the spacing on the floor is going to be different and more open because you're not helping as much. And that's, I think, the key thing that I've seen the last 5 years at college level is just the amount of the lack of help that people are going to give off shooters. It sounds simple, but that's really what everybody has gone to. And I think it started with, hey, we're not giving up corner three. We're not helping there. Well, then it's kind of gone all over the floor with certain people.
I mean, this is both a question and a statement, but has it changed where your players know that it's acceptable to get beat? And not that it's ever acceptable, but at some point you got a sense that you've set up your defense to give up that and not these other things.
Yep.
It used to be, that pass, that final last pass to the weak side, right? And now the game is changing and we don't want to give up that final corner three. So can you talk about that? Do your players know that, like what's acceptable to get beat with?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to the earlier statement, Chris, that when I said that you have to know, like in one sentence, what is the goal of your defense? And, if somebody takes and makes that particular shot, that you and your staff have sat down and said, this is what we're, based on this team right now that we have, this is going to be what we're going to try to sell our guys on giving up. Then you build your defense to suit that. And then when those shots go in, like it's not even like a question of like, hey, what happened? Is that whose fault it is? That, hey, that's what we're giving up. We did our best to try to stop it. And if they make 20 of those, well, I guess they have a chance to win, but whatever that is, we don't think they're going to make 20 of them. So I think that it's key that you just understand what the whole philosophy is. And then your players have to just fight like madmen every possession to try to do that. And then at the end of it, you have to, if you're not emphasizing the rebound and how to rebound and different type of box outs that you might have, I think that you have to constantly emphasize that piece because the first shot defense could be great. I guarantee most teams, if they're any good, if they're getting a second shot, it's probably going in 60 to 70% of the time.
Right. And that's the final piece of all defense is rebounding. And that drill, is it an emphasis? Is it both? Is there a technique that can help the process? Or is it more or less just an emphasis to be able to do something? Because here's the thing is people are crashing from farther from the basket than traditionally.
Yep.
Right? So it's harder to box out traditionally. So what are we teaching in terms of rebounding?
Well, I think in rebounding, Chris, it can kind of be scouting report, personnel driven too. It's like some teams you see less offensive rebounding sometimes because teams are just saying, you know what, we're just going to send three back. And that's been a big change at the NBA level, I think, is just everybody just runs back. You get your shot that you want, you run back, and you're not going to give the other team any easy ones. But there are teams that the college level, for sure, and in the Big Ten, that crash the boards really hard, and they play, they run an offense that's closer to the rim. It makes it easier to get those rebounds, or shorter distance at least. And I bet that's another thing that you have to look at from an individual standpoint is who are just the go-getters. Like they're going to go, we talk about pursuing too. And who are the guys that are just naturally going to do that? And those guys that are kind of the heat-seeking missiles to the ball, check and look at their rebounds. I guarantee, I shouldn't say guarantee, but I'd be willing to think about it from the perspective of like, how many times did they get it because of their box out versus they're just going to get it. But at the same time, that same kid may be guarding in a game a guy that is an elite offensive rebounder. And it has to be an emphasis that game that you have to box this guy out because he is as athletic as you, but stronger. So you have to make that an emphasis. There may be some five men. That's where, they're at the basket or they're coming off a screen and roll and the shot's going up. And now how are you boxing out? And I think if some guys go back on the offensive end, if they're retreating and out of there, then I think it's really important to have your guards not be just to go enter the fight and kind of clean up all the tip balls, etc., that are around down there. So I think rebounding is you have to emphasize it, Chris, and that is how you emphasize it. It's hard to go and do rebounding drills for 8 minutes a day the whole season. That's not going to happen in most programs for most coaches for a variety of reasons, whether it's just philosophy or wear and tear on the body. But it's just got to be an emphasis on what you say when a shot goes up, that, again, you're going to pursue with two, however, whatever deep terminology you're going to use to teach that part of rebounding. I think that's great, but then what are you saying and what are you statting to back up your rebound? Because I really think that that's a key piece of the whole rebounding thing, is making sure that there are some numbers to back that up on what each person's doing. If you're bad off it, like if we can making sure that there are some numbers to back that up on what each person's doing. If you're bad off it, like if we can defensive rebound at 75%, that's pretty darn good throughout the country.
No question.
And you're an elite rebounding team. So if you're down in 65% or 60% range, then you just have to look at it like, what strategies can we use and who's giving them up, and how can we individually kind of take away some of those possessions. And sometimes it can boil down to just a mentality thing and a film study thing, where you don't have to do the 8 minutes a day. It's just like, you've given up X amount and this is what you're going to do individually in order to correct it. And sometimes the phrase, Chris, is simply, we don't care if you get a rebound, don't let your man get one.
Right.
And that might be just a box out and you keep him out of the paint and everybody else cleans up the mess.
Coach, Coach, just circling back quick, you said pursue with two. Can you explain that specifically?
Yeah, I think it's something we really emphasized at Illinois State. I remember saying all the time as a high school coach, and then Coach Muller had said it, and then Coach Beeline has said it. When you go enter that lane and you go for a rebound, it can't be a one-hand tip. It's got to be you pursue with two. And two hands are going up toward the basketball. And that's something that you can easily look at on film after a game. If you've given up an offensive rebound or two, my guess is that there'll be enough on film that you can look and say, you only went up with one. You jump with one hand instead of two. And there are some situations where guys are going to say, Coach, he was holding my arm, and I get it. But at the end of the day, if you go in with two, your chances of getting a read with two hands. So that is the concept behind pursue with two.
No, that's great. And I mean, I notice it within our practices and within our film too. And it's something we try and point out. How many times players go to rebound with their hands at their hips instead of their hands higher? Because obviously that you save that, whatever it is, half a second in terms of not having to lift your hands from your hips to top above your head. And it's amazing. That's so noticeable within practice and within film if you start to watch it, how often that happens.
Yep.
And then the other point that I wanted to kind of ask, but also share, was this concept of once you do get a rebound, of not bringing it straight to your chin, but kind of zigzagging the ball so that a defender can't tip it or reach through it or something like that. Have you heard of that before, that concept?
Yeah.
Do you guys have a term for that?
No, we don't, but I had a high school coach, my assistant coach, my first at LaSalle Peru High School, Steve Parker. He used to say all the time, fight the ball. And then my assistant coach, my first at LaSalle Peru High School, Steve Parker, he used to say all the time, fight the ball. And then he'd say, razor elbows. We weren't trying to hurt anybody, but he says, you got razor blades on your elbows, bite the ball. And that was kind of the mindset that he had. So that's something I always, pursue with two and bite the ball.
That's great.
To keep it high.
That's good stuff. And I mean, we covered obviously so much, like even just some of the practical communication, some of the practical rebounding things. These are areas that probably aren't touched on enough in terms of giving coaches real practical, actionable ideas. So thank you for that. But Coach, I got to ask, I've heard about it in relation to you before, and I'm not sure if it's your term or from someone else, but just about this concept of kill spots. What is this concept, and what are some of these kill spots?
I just think if you take a look at what you're doing, defensive end of the floor, where are you influencing the ball? So whatever the case might be for how you're going to have to influence the ball is just trying to give guys a visual of where to pick the ball up at? Where are you trying to influence the ball, and where are you trying to fight the ball at the time that it's picked up? So it's kind of like your guard in space, but everybody says guard your yard. And again, that's important. But when, because it's going to happen, when and if you do get beat, like, where are you trying to fight that ball to? And that could be different for every defense philosophy, but that's just something that, like, where are you trying to get the ball picked up at?
Yeah, no, that's great. Again, terminology that brings home a message directly to your players about understanding what you want and how you want it done. So it's good.
Yeah, I hope that's something that, like, kind of in our conversation, Chris, is just, I hope, just giving ideas, because you can fit this stuff to how it fits you and your players, obviously, but hopefully just some ideas to think about.
Well, like culture and philosophy and these different things,
Yep.
It goes above and beyond kind of the specific way you defend it. And as you alluded to already, so much of what we do now is scouting report based anyways, that I don't know if I could define us as one type of defensive style. I mean, do we have a base? Yes. But then that base shifts and changes a little bit based on opponent and based on, as you've already alluded to, the quality of your personnel as you figure out your team a little bit more too. So,
yeah, I agree. That is a key thing, though, because your defense changes so much. I mean, your offense does obviously every year, but your defense changes too. And I think NBA level and the college level, you can recruit and you try to sign guys that can kind of play the way you want to play. But even at the college level, it just doesn't work out that way. And you can't always just recruit to say, we're going to play defense this way. Most of it is we open up the conversations geared toward, the offensive side of the way. We're going to play defense this way. Most of it is we open up the conversations geared toward, the offensive side of the ball. And that's obviously a huge piece of it. But, I learned it all thinking about it this way as a high school coach, Chris, in 3 different schools. It was just like every year was totally different. And then you also can see down the road, like as a high school coach, like, man, my sophomore team is like, they're all 6'4" and they can really move. Like, we don't have a big, so we're going to have to run a different offense 2 years from now. And then we probably we can play totally different than we're playing now, because I got a 6'7" kid and another 6'6" kid, but our guards aren't very good. So it was always the talk of our staff, and I'm sure every high school coach, we go through the same thing of looking at, man, my freshman group's really good, and that's going to be, if you learned and valued as 15 years as a high school coach, is just adapting and coming up with creative ways to motivate kids and how to build a program. But at the end of it, it was going to be all about defense, because that's who I was as a basketball player and how my high school coaches taught me. So it ultimately had to evolve each year, and you also had to kind of have this forward thinking, like, what could it look like in 2 years when my sophomores become seniors?
yeah, no, that's great. Great. That you've definitely it's more malleable nowadays than saying it's always one thing. So, Coach,
Yeah.
You mentioned the importance of charting. Maybe are there 3 things you would suggest for a high school coach or a coach at basically any level, that these are 3 things that you should really consider charting on defense that would really help your defense or help your approach? And it doesn't have to be 3 things, but are there some things that you think are things that we should be looking at and saying, hey, this is something you should be charting?
I think the Buzz Williams
Be looking at and saying, hey, this is something you should be charting.
I think the Buzz Williams, and somebody else might have had that before that, but he emphasized the turkeys and the 3 stops in a row. Like, I think that's something that a lot of teams and programs do. And I think that's getting 3 stops in a row at any level is hard. It is hard, especially when you're in the bonus and stuff like that. I mean, it's hard. So I think that's something that is good. And I think just if you're talking about guarding the ball, just trying, how many times you can keep the ball out of the paint, I think is good. And then just a general one is deflections lead to steals. So if you're not a big steal team, if you're not 6'6" long and athletic and 6'4" long and athletic at the high school level and getting out in the passing lanes, you can still get steals, but they just got to come in a different way. It's usually with deflections. So how can you pressure the ball with deflections? So how can you pressure the ball? Deflections that would lead to steals. So I think we kind of lump deflection steals 50-50 balls. kind of all into the same category. And I think that's really promotes effort and activity on the ball, because that's something that I think you can control is, putting your hands from at your hips versus above your shoulders. Like, it takes probably a quarter of a second, but it can make the whole difference on a defensive possession. So I think those are three just general things that I think are good that I know I used at the high school level, the 3 stops in a row. And I heard that from Buzz Williams. That made a huge emphasis. And then trying to keep the ball out of the paint, and then the deflections, steals, and 50-50 balls I think they're all like, can all be emphasized in their own way. And then I would add the fourth one is however you teach rebounding, just have something that you are charting rebounding percentage and just looking at the whole big picture thing, or it could be how you're boxing out or the number of rebounds a certain player doesn't get. Like, I think there has to be some aspect of rebounding that has to be maybe an individual and a team goal within the construct of your program.
No, that's good. It's great stuff. Maybe last, Coach, what are some takeaways from being with Coach Beilein for this time? Like, what are some things that you've took away? I mean, I know that it's a long list, but give us a few insights in terms of clearly he's one of the best coaches around.
Yeah, I think that Coach B always talks about the tone at the top. And I think as leaders, everybody can lead in different ways, but his tone at the top that he sets it's directly aligned with, from a leadership standpoint, which your core values, and from a leadership standpoint, which your core values. And talking to one of my friends about this the other day, a former high school teacher and administrator, and like the big thing when I was in kind of the middle of probably year 7 and 8 of my teaching career was about mission statement. So everybody had a mission statement on the wall. You walked into any school, it was like, here's our mission statement. And you'd have that as a staff meeting. But how many people live the mission statement? And most importantly, do your players live the mission statement, or the students in your building? And a lot of times the answer was no. It was just words. So I think I give that example because when you talk about the tone at the top, Coach Beilein sets a leadership thing that is where everything, our core values, our mission statement is lived out every day, and it's promoted every day. And it's promoted every day. And I think that's how you build your culture, and you get your culture right, and you keep it right for a long period of time by constantly teaching, living, promoting, providing examples, demanding, and every other word that you want to associate with how you want your program to be. So whatever, again, it's just like defense, whatever 3 or 4 things you want to emphasize, you better live it every day. And whatever 4 or 5 things you want to emphasize for your culture, the leader sets the tone at the top, and you have to fight for those core values every day and teach them, not just fight for them, because it's kind of when you say you have to fight for your culture every day, a lot of times it means like your culture is being threatened a lot. But if the fighting is a positive thing too, where fighting can mean you're teaching. So whether it's in practice, in the film room, like there's constantly ways that you can find more ways. Guys could list those out. If I brought them on this podcast right now, they could say them right now into the phone. And then if you followed up and said, hey, give me an example of what that means, that they could do that right away. So I think that would probably be a challenge. We talk about practical things is, could you sit down any one of your players in your office and just say, what's our core values? And then follow it up and say, give me an example of how we live them out. And I think that's something that's Coach B has a lot of different things that I've been able to learn. But I think if you want to talk about culture and gaining success and that type of stuff, I think, that's where it begins and ends is, do the staff and do the players, do they live the vision and live the core values? And ultimately that goes back to how well the leader is living out the core values and the vision, AKA the tone at the top. Goes back to how well the leader is living out the core values and the vision, AKA the tone at the top.
That's outstanding. And what a great message and what a great example of that as well. So we talk about those things a lot, but I think that illustrates what that actually means for a program and what it means for the players to be able to follow the lead of someone at the top. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Coach, thank you so much for taking time on the basketball podcast. I mean, just so many insightful things there. And so many people will be following Michigan this year, but hopefully through this process as well, are they able to reach out to you on Twitter and connect with you as well?
Yeah, Chris, anytime. My Twitter handle is at Coach Yak, at COACHYAK. If anybody want to email me, they can certainly do that too. Yaklich, LYAKLICH at umich.edu, and do our best to always obviously help everybody out that has any questions or anything. I love that part of teaching and coaching is that I always talk on the road. We sit down. I'm sure it happens to you, Chris. You sit next to 6 different coaches watching a game in the summer, and it's something I tried after my first year of getting an understanding for what recruiting was all about. It's just like, we're sitting here, like if you just ask 2 or 3 questions, like even it's just like, hey, how do you teach closeouts? Or, hey, what's the best leadership example that you got? Like, you could ask 2 or 3 questions from somebody, and there's a lot of different ways to be successful. And that's something that I try to do each and every time that, you have time actually to just do that, is to share those ideas. And then you strike up a conversation, and pretty soon, you're emailing back and forth or texting back and forth with one of these coaches from across the country. And there's just, like, we're all in this together. I've always tried to do. And at the same time, I want to be able to do that for other people that I can help out, because in essence, I went into teaching and coaching at the same time, is to try to help and guide and mentor people. And I'm able to do that. Great. And I want to be able to kind of learn from other people at the same time.
Well, and we're all learning from you right now. So again, thank you so much. And coaches, I know you'll have a great experience listening to this. And Coach, we'll circle back at some point personally, and hopefully again, in some other context, to be able to share with Basketball Immersion listeners. So thank you for taking the time.
Yeah. You got it, Chris. Looking forward to speaking at the Iowa Clinic with you in the future. Appreciate the time here on the phone, and looking forward to hopefully doing it again or catching up at the clinic.
Perfect. To find out more about Coach and all we spoke about today, please take a look at the show notes for today's episode. I love to share the game and have basketball coaching conversations, so connect with me on social media. You can find all my basketball coaching conversations, so connect with me on social media. You can find all my social media information and all your membership, clinic, and consulting needs at basketballimmersion.com. That concludes today's episode. I know there are so many podcasts out there. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Basketball Podcast with me, your host, Chris Oliver. Please subscribe and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues so that we can keep bringing you the best of what's out there and share the game.